Aloha, and welcome to the Window Gallery for Invented Instruments virtual artist talk series. I'm David Samus, and I curate this space along with Bart Hopkin and our host tonight, Kirk Pearson. As a result of San Francisco's shelter-in-place order, the Window Gallery is not currently holding in-person events at our landmark space in the Center for New Music at the heart of San Francisco's Tenderloin. But today, Kirk Pearson will be talking to artists in the group exhibition Synth In Place, Folk Electronics Forged in Quarantine, in collaboration with Dogbotic Labs. They'll introduce those artists in just a moment, and that exhibition is on display in the window until the end of February 2021. In March, we'll be showing tonal relativity studies by Alice Centauro. They're beautiful diagrams of musical intervals, and there will be a virtual opening for that exhibition in April. Doa Choder is presenting a virtual exhibition of unique physical interfaces and projection mapping on instruments, and her virtual opening and demonstration will be March 18th. Also stay tuned for Mariel Jacobson in May and Norman Tuck in July. While the Center for New Music remains physically closed to audiences, we have a great series of streaming concerts over on YouTube, and you can find out more about upcoming events at centerfornewmusic.com. If you're a musician, consider becoming a member and letting the Center for New Music produce your next live streaming concert. And until then, stay safe, be well, and with no further ado, this is Kirk Pearson and Synth In Place.
Those never get old. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Kirk Pearson. I am one of the curators of the Window Gallery at the Center for New Music. It is my distinct honor and privilege to be here tonight to host this little roundtable discussion. There are so many interesting musical instruments in this show, and we could only fit so many people in the panel. So it's going to be a small group of 5 of the featured artists here tonight. I'd like to quickly introduce who I am and what we do. Then we're going to introduce our panelists tonight and dig a little bit deeper. My name is Kirk Pearson. I'm a composer and mandolinist originally from New York City. I live here in Berkeley, California now, where I run a creative audio laboratory called Dogbotic. So a lot of the times what we do is we use alternative techniques or invented instruments to make new and interesting sounds for people. Sometimes that's, they're used within, film scores, theater productions, live installations. And since COVID started, we've been doing an online workshop series where we teach people about, such of those techniques. So we've been hosting this DIY synthesizers curriculum, which all of these creations that you've seen, with the exception of one, were forged from. And we also started doing another workshop about a tape technique called cassette hacking, where we ship you a whole bunch of consumer Walkman, and we teach you to take them apart and do weird reconstructive surgery on the inside to let them do all sorts of interesting musical things that the manufacturer didn't intend. Thank you so much for the center for hosting us these past 2 months. I got a nice visual aid here. Poster designed by our own Maisie Byerly, who you will be meeting in a minute. This has been such a delight to put together. It's very weird to put together a gallery show during COVID, when we know no one's visiting galleries. So we've designed the show to be entirely viewable from the street. Everything faces outward. There are QR codes you can scan with your phone, which will give you more information about the instruments. And a couple of them you can actually interact with through transparent glass. So yes, thank you to Anne-Marie Cordero, David Samus, Bart Hopkin, Brett, everyone else at the Center for New Music. It has been our pleasure to take up your window space for the last 2 months. And we hope you've all enjoyed having us around. So I'd like to go around and introduce the panel right now. I think we're going to kind of jump from one person to the next. So please tell us a little bit about yourself and your own creative practice and which of the pieces was yours, and then we'll dig a little bit deeper. I also wanted to start with a little bit of an icebreaker question, which is DIY synthesizers, very broadly, don't tend to be very stable. They don't tend to produce sounds that you can replicate very easy. It's hard to play Bach on a DIY synthesizer. Yet the practice of building these things seems to have enamored all of us enough to merit the dozens and dozens of hours that we've all poured into these creations. And so my initial question is, what does the practice of DIY electronics mean to you? And yeah, what have you taken from that experience? So I'd like to start out, by introducing Kitty Cooper from Charlottesville, Virginia. Kitty, how are you doing?
Hi.
Hello.
So I guess just to introduce myself, I'm a composer and performer and teacher. I live in Charlottesville. I play guitar and electronic things. And my piece was It's Being Isn't It Alone, which is the one with the box with the rocks on top of it. It's 2 boxes. One of them you play with different weights of objects, and the other one you play with light, so that you put in color slides and it changes the sound of the synthesizer. Kirk, do you want me to also answer the question or pass to someone to introduce themselves?
Well, if you think that's a good, we'll be going in obviously more in depth into everyone later. But if you're happy with that introduction, you can pass it along.
Okay, I'll pass it to Maisie.
Thanks, Kitty. I am the creator of the last synthesizer in the video that's in an old saltine container made with found objects like the lip kazoo. And this is my first time making a synth, and it's kind of my first musical foray in a while. I'm coming from more of an illustration background. And so to me, DIY, well, we might get into that question later, but this process was, making the synth was about getting away from my perfectionism in the realms where I can control things creatively and get into something where I can't control it. I'm going to pass it to Sean.
Hello, Sean. I'm unmuted, so I can click later. Thank you, Zoom. I'm a composer. I make electronic music. I also play guitar, as you might be able to see. And pretty much anything anybody gives me, like my wife gives me musical instruments, so I play those, like a Shruti box she gave me once. I really like that thing. And I make experimental music mostly, which I think of as not just, music that you'll never hear in an elevator, but to sort of foreground the DIY element, it's music that, to paraphrase something Kirk says that I'm often thinking of when I compose with my own electronic stuff is music that composes you as much as you compose it. So that's sort of why I'm interested in this stuff, the unpredictability of all of it. And yeah, for me, that's a real source of life that you don't get if you're working, to speak digital audio-ese for a second, if you're working in the box or you're working with just, ones and zeros. So my piece was the video piece called Luminiferous Ether, which is a concept that we can talk about later if people actually want to. I will pass it to Mei Ling.
Thank you, Sean. Hi, my name is Mei Ling. This one. I'm a composer. I write for traditional instrument and also electronic music. And the piece you saw earlier in the video is the one I did called Crooked House. I had a lot of fun doing that project. So yeah, I'm glad to be here. Glad to see everyone. Okay, I'm going to pass to Alex.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Christie. I'm a composer and an improviser of electronic and acoustic music, and I build electronic music instruments. Sometimes they interact with light, and frequently they are intentionally bureaucratic or inefficient. The piece of mine that you saw was the one on the chessboard. I think it's called Chessboard or Chessboard Synthesizer. And happy to be here. Thanks for coming out, everyone. I'll pass it back to Kirk.
Well, thank you all so much. I would like to actually start appropriately, well, not appropriately, in the same order. I actually do have a question for Kitty. So Kitty's piece, it's really quite beautiful. It actually has two parts, and we could only show one in the video. They're two independent synthesizers. One of them is controlled by weight, and the other one is controlled by light. And Kitty describes the piece as simultaneously a composition and an instrument, which I think is very interesting. Kitty, what do these terms mean to you, and when do they start blending together to describe something that's independent of either of them?
Oh, interesting. I think generally I like tapping into the sort of gray area between the two. And a lot of what I see in common between compositions and like custom build instruments is like creating systems and ways of interacting that are sort of specific to the ideas you're thinking about. And I think that's something that you can do with both compositions and instruments. So that's sort of the middle area that I like tapping into, I think. I don't know, I could spend all day defining those words, but I think it's more fun not to sometimes than to just sort of play with doing both of them at the same time.
Yeah, I think a thing that repeatedly, I don't know, hits my brain whenever I'm putting together one of these things is just how quickly the practice of DIY electronics makes it really easy for you to lose all working definitions of things like composer and instrument. But as far as novel user interfaces go, so your two pieces in this show I think are truly unique. You don't play them like any other instrument that we have in this collection. I was curious if throughout the building process you learned any interesting lessons about user interfaces and how those relate to sonic output. Like, are there any interesting gestures that you could get out of a synthesizer that's played by weight versus a synthesizer that's played in a more, traditional keyboard style setup?
Thanks. I started out with the idea that one of the boxes would be more focused on like tactile input, like moving objects around, and that one would be more focused on light. And it turned out, I guess I learned that it was a lot more difficult to start with an idea and realize that idea when in the past I've like tinkered and then come up with ideas from there. This seemed a lot more challenging because I I decided that I was going to play the instrument with weights, and then started gathering objects, and it turned out that like the force sensors that I was using, the objects were too heavy for it. And so it was kind of a learning process of learning what the instrument could do, and sort of changing what I was thinking about and changing what the instrument would do. And they were sort of informing each other until I got a little more comfortable and figured out a way to play it that made sense for the piece.
How do you play it? The little video that we saw before. So everyone was kind enough to send the instruments to me, where I filmed them prior to Sean and myself installing them at the Center for New Music. But how I play the synthesizer might totally be completely off from how the composer intended it to be played. So yeah, how is your process as a performer working with your piece?
Sorry, yeah, I should have explained that. So the box that you play with weights and objects, I wanted to create something like really beautiful and slow, which is not an area that I often tap into. So I kind of wanted to challenge myself to do that. And I was thinking about themes of like memory. So a lot of the objects are things from my life. So the way that you play the weight one is like very slowly moving and adjusting objects on the force sensors. And then the light one, it has like a smaller box off to the side that has a light that shines through a color slide. So you like switch out the color slides, like after a couple of minutes, and let the sound world settle in to match the like sort of fuzzy image that's being projected.
That's beautiful. While we're talking about user interfaces here, I did have a question for Alex. So like Kitty's piece, Alex's synthesizer also makes use of a totally novel, non-musical interface. It's built out of a chessboard. And we discussed this a lot throughout the building process in the workshop. But Alex's machine toys with a lot of really interesting concepts. And one of the key themes is an analogy that he draws between a game of chess and the development of synthesizers itself. Alex, what significance does chess have to you, and why did you pick a chessboard as your interface?
Yeah, great. So I think I should just put on the record that I really like chess, but when I say that, I'm not saying I'm really good at it. So let's just let the record show. Yeah. So Kirk, I used to play chess a lot, and I started playing chess again a lot more during the pandemic. And what was interesting to me was reading up on the history of technological interactions with chess. So, back in the 90s, IBM started developing computers to play chess, and there was this big thing about humans beating computers and computers beating humans at chess. And they're like, I can't remember how many, but some immense number of possible outcomes for any given chess game from start to finish. And I think that this human-computer interaction and like sometimes competition is something that happens in electronic music too, where you can design an electronic music instrument to be performed by a human or be performed by a computer or somewhere in the middle. And sometimes this takes a form of problem solving, and sometimes it takes a form of art making, and sometimes those two things intersect. So I think what I was really interested in was building an instrument out of a chessboard that was very much focused on technology that isn't super polished and that doesn't offer all these solutions to large infinite problems. So one analogy is like the difference between the DIY synth that I built and machine learning is the same as like the way I like to play chess and the way that an IBM computer would play chess. So I'm not, there's no judgment here, but I think that those two paths are parallel in a way that I think is very interesting, where technology enters the scene and like redefines the way we interact by calculating the most efficient way to interact. And this instrument is interested in the opposite of that.
You also had, I believe you are unique in this particular subset of people in that your particular synthesizer incorporates a voltage starve feature. Could you explain what that is and the repercussions of putting that in a synthesizer?
Yeah, so the voltage starve is really fun. Basically, it's just it's just a knob that controls how much voltage from the battery is actually allowed into the circuit, and it's there's a little bit of a conceptual tie there too, where there's as a human you can reach and turn that knob, and you're kind of like a little bit changing this power dynamic between human performer and electronic instrument. But the voltage starve just reduces how much power the synthesizer gets, and it kind of throws it into this really unpredictable state. Um, and sometimes, and I mean like actually unpredictable, not like unpredictable where it's necessarily fun. Sometimes it kind of just turns off or just like settles on a tone, but other times it like launches into some sound world that you maybe wouldn't have um, gotten to on your own. So uh, I think it's really fun just for discovering new sounds, but it's also fun in just in terms of just changing the dynamic between the human user and the electronic interface.
Well, transitioning from this to a master of human computer interaction. This is a question for Mei Ling. So Mei Ling Lee has an amazing body of work and a really interesting career working with data-driven instruments. You can look at her recital, which just went up on YouTube a couple months ago. It's sensational stuff. She builds all sorts of really fantastic user interfaces that are just as entrancing to watch her perform as they are to listen to. So I think Mei Ling, like some of the rest of us, started out like as a pretty traditional composer and then slowly went down the experimental electronics route. I guess, so my question for Mei Ling was, has working with these novel interfaces changed how you compose or how you think about the relationship between performer and composer? It's a loaded question.
Yes. So I started as a composer, has a background, composed for traditional instrument. And when I compose for the traditional instrument, I am not the one really performing it. So the concept or the process is, I would think, is different. Right now, I compose music or composition for data-driven instrument with the idea in mind that I will be the one performing it. And also very, very different is when I write for traditional instruments, say like piano, flute, you has the set of gesture has been familiar for hundreds of years. And even though you can be inventive, like a more creative way to perform it, but you still have something to follow, say, okay, the bowing on the string, but for the data-driven instrument I'm working on, or I'm pursuing degree right now, it is kind of like open up the world so wide that I can do anything, I can perform anything, I can do any gestures that I can imagine and of doing it. So I really like that freedom and opportunity of it. And then, yes, it does make it different in the process of composing for traditional instruments, for electronic music instrument. Sometimes it overlap. I would say, there's overlap. I still have the similar process. I still think about form, think about not really chord progression, but has kind of those, because it's inside me, but also you focus on the sound, and now you don't think the noises. They sometimes you found the beauty of it, which I was probably not aware of 15, 20 years ago. So I really like the position I'm in right now, kind of try to bridge them together, use it as a language, more powerful language for me to deliver whatever the content, the message I would like to have my audience know. Yeah.
That's an excellent answer. There are countless reasons why I love the Cricket project so much. But in lieu of telling you the reasons why I think it's so beautiful, yeah, why does the Cricket do it for you? What was the significance of putting together a Cricket house? It was also a collaborative project, right?
Yes, yes,
Right.
it is. Yeah. For many years, no matter what instrument I wrote to, when I do music as a composer, I feel like I want to deliver my ideas or show the world how I feel the world. So you can, if you look at most of my compositions, that is drawing the inspiration from things around me that happened to me, or I saw it, I feel it. I grab everything from life around me. And I have two little girls. Now they're not little anymore. And you want to be a perfect mom, you want to be a perfect housewife, and you just want to be a perfect composer. And I realized, I cannot really separate them. I have to somehow combine them all together and just suck everything in. So the way I get inspiration from everything I did is if I can just spend time with things around me, which is my family, as much as I can. So I figure out if I do my composition around them, they will give me more time to spend with them. And I really like that. So the Cricket House, when I'm in the workshop with Kirk, we have a project, and I think you mentioned something about Cricket House, or you say crooked, and we can make the sound. So I thought that's not a bad idea. I'm going to do this because kids like interesting sound. So I started talking to my girls, and they seemed happy because I said, hey, if I built this, and I will let you paint. So they got excited because they like to paint. So the project you see, the all painting around the house, even the crooked, she designed it herself. And so it turned into a project we collaborate together. And then we even kind of perform together, which is, I would tweak around the crooked sound, and then she will grab a mandolin or it's just some instrument, guitar, and just drumming there along with my beat. So I thought, that is amazing. To me, I feel like as a composer, what I want to show to the world is how I feel it. So that is a project that I can share with my family, share how I feel with my family. So yeah, I thought that was pretty cool.
Correct answer. I mean, obviously there's no correct answers for any of it, but I absolutely love that. I totally agree. I feel like, I mean, I feel like for me and for a lot of people, yeah, composition is ultimately a social thing. That's the fun in it. If your piece of music at the end of the day doesn't involve, doesn't come back down to people, then what point are you trying to make? But I absolutely agree. That's what's always drawn me to composition and to these activities in general. They're inherently social, and generally always, I don't know, I think provoke interesting conversations. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Again, we're going to come back to everybody. I just wanted to do little quick rounds of introductions. Maisie Byerly, hey there. So Maisie and I have actually been working together since prior to the COVID lockdown. But Maisie's been designing stuff for Dogbotic for well over a year now. She designed everything from the parody cassettes that we send out. This is a tape loop that you get in the cassette hacking workshop to our gallery poster. So Maisie's an illustrator that has a very keen and obvious sense of humor, which clearly shows in her piece. So Maisie, in what ways did your process as a visual artist inform your work building the synthesizer, and also the character that you ended up creating?
Thanks, Kirk. I think that working with the materials that we had brought out a lot of, I just wanted to create kind of these soft innards that went inside a body. And I wanted that body to be quite just like immediately recognizable and appealing to people, and it would say, "Yup, I've got it. That's like a creature." And then when you pull the lid off the top, you know, a lot of the things are actually attached to the lid, so you get these kind of like cascading wires. And every time I did that, I lost a connection. So then I'd have to take it back and keep resoldering, and it started to feel like surgery. I think that in that way, I felt like, you know, I was coming at the synth trying to give it personality, because that's what I'm always looking for in my illustrations, is giving things personality. And then the materials started to kind of provide their own personality. Partly because if you're trying to make something, I started out with a lot of set designs of what I wanted my final product to look like. And then I couldn't get, you know, my circuits to fit in any of that housing. And once I put my circuits in their housing, it didn't stand the way it used to stand. So like there were so many ways in which the process of building and the materials and the circuits kind of started to create this character that I had to interact with, and I had to listen to the character's feedback of how it wanted to exist, which at different moments led me to be screaming in the workshop, you know, why won't you just be a better looking character? But yeah, I mean, it's things like I really wanted to use found materials, partially because they restrict what, you know, you have to respond to them as they're, like, you have to respond to how you can build with them. So like the arms of my synth are made out of this old tubing from a Ford F1 truck. And it's really like grimy and quite resistant. And so I had that holding up its own amp, but just getting that to work without pulling off its own connections, that was quite a process. So yeah, I mean, I think that at the heart of your question was probably, you know, like bringing out those personalities in illustrations, and then how that applies to the synth process and building a character out of a synth. I think that it's some combination of approaching the synth initially the way I would approach an illustration, and then also adjusting based on the materials and the challenges that came up along the way.
An extension to that question. So the name of the piece, by the way, is "We'll Always Have Las Vegas," and it's this beautiful duo of ragtag musical puppets. What is the story of that title? What does Las Vegas mean to you? I have my way of interpreting the relationship these characters have to Las Vegas, but we've never actually discussed this.
Well, the other character that's not in the video was made by a friend who's living with me here in Indiana, and both of us were really struggling. The housing for her synth is a chewed up dog toy, or a dog.
The toy part is important there, yeah.
And so it's quite like gruesome in certain ways, and so I think that we were both kind of going at the synth project initially thinking we can make really awesome clean synths and all of the connections will like work out, and this is going to be the best vacation to Las Vegas ever. And then, you know, you're 24 hours in and you don't remember why things are going wrong, and you can't figure out how to get things back on track, and you're just two friends, you know, stuck in an alleyway trying to piece your bad soldering connections back together. So I think it was mostly about these two kind of characters struggling, and then also through sound we were like, you know, sometimes we got sounds that were a bit siren-like, which just added to the ambiance of like two characters having a rough time in Las Vegas, and then also just like kind of these horrible moaning sounds that were like painful or concerned. And so I think it was honestly our characters started to dictate to us that we weren't going to have some clean cut and dry, this is what I wanted to do and this is what it is. And the name kind of was a response to that.
They both really reinforce each other really well. Like they sound exactly like they look, and the title, I don't know, I think really adds a lovely counterpoint to that. I don't know, yeah, I'm broadly curious of people's interpretations of the piece too. But thank you so much. Sean Hallowell, hey buddy. So a fun fact of Sean Hallowell. Sean has a PhD in musicology. Sean is a medieval music scholar.
How are you gonna out me like that in front of everyone?
Yeah, sorry. Kirk? You know, everyone points at Sean. No, anyway, Sean
Kirk's lying. It's not true. None of it's true.
Columbia in medieval music. Well, yeah. Well, a lot of the stuff that Sean produces is, you know, the furthest thing from medieval music you might think. In what ways? Well, yeah. First of all, could you discuss what your piece is? Because if anyone has walked by the Center for New Music in the last 2 months, you probably see that first. It's huge.
I didn't realize that these questions were going to be so heavy hitting. I thought these were going to be softball questions, but all right, I guess it's on. In the interest of, I guess, talking about the piece itself, and by piece, I mean instrument, because for me, it's kind of the two are the same thing. And then if time permitting, we can talk about medieval music, which I'm always happy to talk about.
But yeah.
yeah. Well, let's start where we start. So I'll share my screen, which, if you know, because in the video, that's the prototype in my studio. That's not the real deal. So let's see if this works. There's a picture of the thing, and I think people should be able to see it, hopefully. So if you remember in the video, there's a TV too. So it's for, you know, you see like a cassette deck, little Walkman thing to the left on that picture, and that's one element. There's the stuff in the middle, which I can talk about in a second, and then there's the television. Altogether, they are generating signals that are, you know, simultaneously producing audio and video, or, you know, audio and visual patterns that are related through circuitry, etc. I don't need to get into why or how, but the crux of the idea, I guess, is that you have this thing that is generating audio and video at the same time, that in a way that's related, that's perceptually salient, but at the same time is off kilter enough that you know, ideally never get bored looking or listening to it simultaneously. That's the goal. It's a sort of classic, I guess, you know, aim of composition, to be repetitive enough to keep you hooked, but not so repetitive that you get bored listening, right? And this is something that I actually learned by listening to medieval music after having listened to, you know, 4/4 tonal harmony my whole life growing up, you know, where I did, and listening to what I did, not to get music theory on everybody. But so the other element that I guess is worth pointing out is that, so in this picture, you should be able to see a panel of little guys coming out at the top and then plugs at the bottom. And those little guys are what we call in the business photoresistors, which is just a way of saying that they're components that give you different values in the circuit based on how much light falls on the little sensors. And so this panel is facing the window, and the idea for the piece was, as the day goes on and, you know, light turns to dark and back again, the piece itself actually changes character, because those resistors are hooked up through the cables there to the circuit in such a way that the frequency of the oscillator, or the tempo of the pattern, or even like the timbre of the synth changes accordingly. So that's just a little bit more about the piece. As for, I guess, yeah, Kirk, I don't know, where would you like me to go from there? Because you're the boss. So
well, we can go where you want. The question I wrote down was, in what realms does your piece actually play homage to medieval concepts or theories?
Okay, so you're really gonna make me do it. All right, I'll do it.
We don't have to go here.
No, it's, well, look, people probably got like dinner plans, so I don't want to bore anybody, but yeah, so the basic idea is that luminiferous ether is this concept from physics. If you ever took any physics in your life. Maybe you heard about it. They used to think that light needed something to travel through to propagate, right? But turns out you don't need that. There's, the general theory of relativity, or theory of general relativity, rather, that tells you there's no such thing as empty space or empty space-time. It's what we call space and time are just the effects, perceptual effects of matter and energy. I don't want to get too far into it. The idea is that you don't need this kind of empty space, right, through which to travel. The traveling is the thing. And it got me thinking about, well, when I'm listening and watching, listening to this piece and watching it simultaneously, and these patterns are sort of resonant both as I'm hearing them and as I'm seeing them, and I can tell that there's this third thing, which is the circuit itself that's generating the patterns that are synced, and thinking more about sort of the ability to perceive that, what gives me the ability to perceive the congruence of the audio and the visual, or like the two dimensions simultaneously. To me, that's something like a thought bearing ether. Like, I'm getting a little bit metaphysical on you, but the reason is that medieval music, right, when you think about, I'm not going to recite my dissertation, but they had a whole way of thinking about music as connected to not just sound, but all forms of vibration and radiation. They wouldn't have called it that, but basically this idea that the whole universe is a musical composition, and our perceptual apparatus is tuned to the frequency of that composition, and that's what gives us the ability to perceive patterns, and from patterns to deduce principles and discern intentionality and do all these things. So it's this whole way of thinking about music as the key or gateway to a much more profound order, and music is just not just one of, but actually a privileged way of accessing that realm. And so for me, when I think about that stuff, I'm always thinking of it in a medieval context. So really, when I say I make medieval music, it doesn't sound medieval or it doesn't look medieval, but the underlying principle to me is always, goes back to that tradition. How's that sound as an
I think
answer?
that's amazing.
Okay.
Thank you, Sean. I guess so. Also, to all of our friends in the audience, in a few minutes, we're going to start having general questions. Please shoot me a message in the chat. Don't send it to the one that says face. Send it to Kirk computer, and then I can see it on my computer, and then I will bring up the questions ever so seamlessly. But a general roundtable question, and anyone can grab this if they want. So. A nice thing about DIY synthesizers in general is, you only kind of have to know what you're doing in order to make something that sounds interesting. Why I think synthesizers are a great way of learning electrical engineering is that the output you're creating doesn't have to be perfect, right? If you're designing some, I don't know, circuit that stops an elevator when it's catapulting to the ground, accuracy matters a lot. In the case of synthesizers, right, we're creating patterns with voltage that are culturally interesting. So one of the main facets to getting good at building these kind of ridiculous machines is learning to let go, and understanding that the thing that you create in the end is probably not going to be the thing that you set out to create in the beginning. So my general question to all of you is, how did you learn to let go when you were building? And if anyone cares to take that.
I can answer that to start it off. The friend I was working with was named Carly, and her synth made this amazing sound. It was this revving motor sound that went in and out, and we played it through the speakers, and it sounded so good. And then she soldered it, and it didn't make that sound anymore. And suddenly it made this really clean, chirpy sound that she really didn't like. And then I plugged my synth in, and it started making that beautiful revving sound that we just loved and we wanted to replicate. And then we realized that was just the sound that it made whenever we had bad connections. And so we kind of had to abandon this dream synth that we had because if we wanted anything to last and make music at the end, we kept trying to get close to that with our actual connections, but we ended up finding, you know, little ways to replicate that, but then also accepting that our final product wasn't going to be this thing that we stumbled along the way, which was a helpful perspective also, because your synth, at least for me, breaks 50 times before it's done. So, you know, it's going to change. It's not necessarily going to be the same thing at the start that it is at the end.
Just to second that, very well said, right? And I think that's why everybody who takes this workshop, or that we know that has taken it, or anyone really who's in analog synth building themselves, like, it's so resonant, because you are, especially if you are sort of weaned in this like Western art music tradition, which is obviously very institutionalized in like an exclusionary way. You think about music as this very abstract thing that is, you know, like somebody crouched over a piano with a quill in their hand, like plucking notes out of the ether, so to speak. But actually, when you make something like a synth, you're forced to deal with all this like messy materiality, and Kirk often pointed out in the workshop, and I think it's a really good takeaway, that the kinds of things you use to make music end up determining what the music is, how it sounds when it comes out the other end. And it's really not the other way around, which is, I found it as like somebody who was trained in that tradition of abstract thinking about music, that, you know, it's pretty revolutionary to understand your process as being sort of bottom up instead of top down. So yeah, just what Maisie said, what she said really resonated with me for that reason.
Yeah, I would add something to that too, which is that it's for me, the letting go is really fun, because it kind of helps me make decisions, in the sense that the technology you're working with has its own agency, and you can. It doesn't mean you can't be creative with it, but I like letting the technology and like the circuit and the components sort of speak for themselves a little bit, in a way that, you know, invites me in to tinker and experiment and redirect and see what else is there. But the letting go is in some ways a relief, and it's fun and really informative to be taught by the circuit that you're building, as you're building it. And I think if you weren't willing to let go, you don't get to learn and be taught by it in so many different ways.
Well, I got another question. It's another general roundtable question. So we kind of put together the curriculum for the workshop in hopes that we would find other creative people to take it. So really the workshop is built for people that have pre-existing creative practices. Not all of them are musicians. Like, you know, Maisie's an illustrator. We have a lot of illustrators, animators, dancers, performers. People really come from all around. My question was, how has learning this practice, or, you know, getting your feet wet in homemade electronics, changed other aspects of your creative practice, if at all? We didn't rehearse these beforehand, as you can tell. This is the first time they're hearing all of these. They're terrified.
Go ahead, Kitty.
Okay. I guess I think a lot of the same things from the last question, but I think there's a lot of creativity there that has made me realize that like I really enjoy making things that look cool in addition to sounding cool, and it's made me think about the work that I'm making in like a more all-encompassing way instead of just about sound. And so it feels like it opens up a lot of creativity that I didn't feel like was as open when I was trying to learn how to make electronic music on like computers and stuff. Because there's something about like circuits and little bits that are like extremely cheap to buy that just kind of makes you want to, like, I don't know, hot glue them to a bunch of stuff and see what you end up with.
Sean, you had a thought?
Yeah, I guess my only other thing yeah, I totally agree with Kitty's point. And I think the other cool thing is that like you have a different attitude towards pre-made electronics after this, and which by which I mean like if you're the kind of person who's ever taken things apart and looked at them and been like, what could I do with this? I wish I knew how this worked. After studying, basic circuit design and figuring out the sort of lay of the land, it's really empowering to look at consumer electronics and say, I can, bend that, I can fix that, I can do this and that with anything really, because the basic operating components are common to everything. And so the big thing it did for me was another thing. I just keep plugging things Kirk taught us in the workshop, but like another thing they would often say is, like we're trying to demystify technology, like the black box of technology. And I think in our society, we're so conditioned to, revere the commodity and not put things like electronics under scrutiny to see what untapped potential they might have. But, once you learn how to do, make an oscillator, then it's a totally different story. And you feel, I don't know, like empowered to literally just, again, I'm just stealing all of Kirk's best lines, but literally dismantle consumerism. So, yeah.
I guess I'll jump in. I want to just go back a little bit with the previous question about, how do you let go, and or how you face the failure. But what I feel is we learn more from the failure than from the success. And what I look at, when making, like taking this workshop, making all those sensors, making new instruments, it's gonna be failure because we're at the front to trying. And why you think you cannot replicate the sound you were hoping after you soldering them or after you make the second one is totally different, because it's just not being done enough. Why the piano, Yamaha piano, they all sound the same because they have been tried so many thousands times of failure, and they figure it out. Oh yeah, I do this. And then I kind of really proud of our group, is like we are actually at the front, do all the sorts of experiments. And of course it's gonna fail because that's what we want to test it out and try to do things. Hopefully, in 10, 15, 20 years, something we built will get to the level with just like, yeah, it's working every single time. Okay, that's the previous question. In terms of the how we jump from our earlier, our principle, our area, and now jump into this kind of new things, how it impact my a process or working process, how it changed. What I agree with Sean a little bit is it's not really changing the way I process or I make music. It's actually open up, like I said before, open up more doors, more opportunities. And I think I'm still the same me. I'm still doing the same music, what I aspire, but now I have, after taking the workshop, I feel like, hey, I can, instead of using a violin to make sound, now maybe I can make one string only and then generate something, but it's still connected. So that's how I look at how how this new thing, new world has impact in my creative work. Hope that makes sense.
Oh, most certainly makes sense. It's a lovely answer. So I have one final question, I think, before we're going to wrap up. And this is a thing that everyone in the panel has heard me rant about for a long time. But as we were putting together the curriculum over the course of 2020, I kept on butting heads with one particular term that I found everywhere that I'd been using my entire life, and that term is music technology. It's a term that we all use, and I don't mean to rag on people that teach music technology and music technology programs. I myself was one of those people. The term music technology, though, I find really unsatisfyingly vague, right? Like it's a term, it involves defining two very ill-defined words, music and technology, which I don't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. But the major issue with it is that it seems to connote something very specific to people, and the thing that it connotes is access to resources, right? Like when you think music technology, you're going to think large corporations that make stuff. You're going to think big academic institutions that produce stuff. Like the term music technology isn't very specific because it doesn't really, it doesn't say anything about what you're doing, right? All music technology does as a term really successfully is exclude people and make a particular populations of people feel like it's much harder to say that they're participating within music technology. Right? Like certainly the invention of a piano or any instrument would count as music technology, but why don't we call things like nylon, for instance, right? Like nylon changed the shapes you could make with your body when you were clothed, but we don't refer to nylon as dance technology, right? Why do we hold music technology on this really weird exclusive pedestal? The one thing that I think is interesting about the term music technology is stuff that it describes is always stuff that is political, right? Just like everyone's, heard somebody rag on, oh, electronic music isn't really music. It's just people pressing buttons at the front of a club, right? I can most surely say that, when the piano was invented, someone was going, oh, that's not a real musical instrument, right? That's just like a velocity sensitive button machine. It's not a flute. And to that extent, I could also imagine the first, Neanderthals making bone flutes in caves and someone going like, oh, well, it's not the human voice, right? Like music technology is this weird process that always involves changing people's pre-existing definitions of what music is, which I think is really interesting. So a term that a better definition of music technology, which isn't perfect, but I think at least addresses some of these problems, is that music technology is finding musical applications for apparently non-musical things. It's the same thing that makes you look at a computer and go, gee, this giant number crunching machine might be really good at laying out compositions, or for that matter, looking at a bag of, integrated circuits, resistors, diodes, etc., and saying, gee, these things could actually, mediate how the world sounds. My question to the panel is, has going through this process changed any of working definitions that you had, terms such as instrument, composer, or even music? Also a very loaded question.
For me, at least, it definitely changed the meaning of the word instrument, just because I wouldn't have thought of creating a creature that could be an instrument. I think at one point during the class, I said I want to make a DIY Tickle Me Elmo, but I would never consider a Tickle Me Elmo an instrument. I wouldn't have put it in that category. But then when I get to compose for it, or I get to create the sound for it, then it becomes, that starts to enter the realm of instrument. And so that was something that changed for me, was thinking about, oh, I could, if I wanted to, decorate my entire house with representational sculptures, but they would all be, instruments in their own way. Even though that's not how instruments usually look or are interfaced with.
Yeah, I think something that the workshop and this process informed for me was related to something that Kitty mentioned earlier, this idea of gray areas, and also my role as a human interacting with those gray areas. where when you're building an instrument from like components up, I mean, it's an act. It feels like an active composition. I mean, it is an active composition, and the idea of like that word, like the capital C composer, which also has all these connotations similar to what you were saying, Kirk. That getting kind of muddied was really nice and liberating for me, where it did feel like I was collaborating with the composition and the instrument and the technology all at the same time in a way where it wasn't just my input into that system. So it was, I think, something that changed for me was really seeing this connection between the composition and the instrument and the system and me, and how all those things together made this whole other thing happen that wouldn't have happened if I had had things more strictly defined in some of the ways you were referring to in your question.
Thank
Yeah, just sorry. Go ahead. Who's Katie? Go.
We keep doing that. I think also too, to loop back to music technology, DIY technology really made it into something that I could do. Like I had been trying to learn how to make sounds come out of my computer, but it's very expensive, and I'm not one of those people who can like learn very well from online tutorials and stuff. Um, and so for me, making my own stuff was the first time that I had been able to partake in that. And so now when I do, I feel like extra compelled to put my voice on it and be like, yeah, I'm making music and it's technology, but it's also like mine now. I don't know. Yeah.
Um, I'll jump in. I feel like, to me, I don't really like any terminology. I totally agree what Kirk say. When you give something, a group, a name, there's always a political issue, political agenda in there. Think about, just say electronic music. There's so many different terms: electronic music, computer music, electroacoustic music. What is the difference between them? I feel like it's not necessary to define that. The only reason I feel when you need a terminology is easier to communicate. So like the dance music, there's so many type of EDM genre. Why bother to separate them? And when you define them, I always think define particular genre just for, like promotion purpose or political purpose. And then you're gonna have another turn pretty soon. Someone gonna come up something, and you will always chase it. I feel, I feel like, don't think about the terminology. Like you said, musical technology. If you say music technology, really just suddenly lock in. Oh, does that mean computer? That means synthesizer? No, but actually, what we are doing is music technology. So I think it's not, I don't feel comfortable enough to, whenever you come up something, you try to find a box to lock it in, say, oh, this fits this. And yeah, that's just my thoughts of those terms. Thank you.
And just one last little bit, which is, I think, a common theme for everyone that I've talked to who took this workshop is that so much of education, or like good education, is actually just unlearning things that you thought you knew. And for me, that big moment was as a composer thinking about technique as its own thing. So technique as the thing that is, again, abstract before it's concrete, that it's something you apply to material, that it is prior to composition, that it's, that there's this order of operations that must be followed. The reason that almost everything I make has a substantive analog component is that it just reminds you that technique and technology are, in fact, not to take us past the Middle Ages, but, they come from the same root word. They really just have to do with your intentional activity towards sound And there is, for all the same reasons that have already been mentioned, no good reason for separating the two other than gatekeeping. And yeah, I find that very simple, but also, you know, as these things tend to be, like, very profound realization.
I think a kind of common goal that we've had with these workshops is they're like the only music class you'll take that hopefully you leave much more confused about what music is than when you started. Well, we're at time, but thank you all so much. This was a wonderful panel, and this was it was really a joy to curate this exhibition. Thank you all so much for submitting your work. We have some posters designed by Maisie Byerly, which you can buy online for this show. And all the money from them goes directly to financial aid for our workshops. Every workshop we do has financial aid. This is not supposed to be another rich kid STEM camp, right? If you want to take this workshop, we want to do our best to make sure that you can. Also, yeah, there was a question earlier, but we do have sessions open for this very workshop that we've been discussing right now. In April, I'm teaching 2 of them, and Sean is actually teaching the other 2. There is a link online, which Anne-Marie direct messaged to me, but we'll group message in a second, where you can see a virtual museum with all of these pieces in it, and you can look at them in greater detail. Thank you so much to the Center for New Music for hosting us. Thank you to David, Anne-Marie, Brent, and Bart. It's lovely working with all of you. Coming up in the gallery after we clean this exhibition out, we have Alice Centauro, who's actually in the group right now. It's diagrams of musical intervals. They're beautiful. Works in tonal relativity studies appropriately. And in the virtual gallery next month, there'll be a piece by Doa Chowder, which is projection mapping on musical instruments, and it is beautiful. On that note, thank you all so much. I'm Kirk Pearson. I have been your host tonight. It's been a pleasure. Thank you all so much. Have a good night.